Ben, I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead, James.
So at work, the hurricane hit us pretty bad. We lost a couple calves and stuff, but a lot of our field, we work along the James River. That's where our entire work is. So you can imagine getting that much rain in 3 or 4 hours. We've lost a lot of far. What am I trying to say? A lot of the winter wheat we've planted has no hope. I mean, it's under like 2 foot of water, but it really put us in a bad situation because we're desperately trying to get the sorghum cut, and they were telling me that I just started with the cross crew. They were telling me that we can't. It's imperative we get it cut before frost because when frost hits sorghum, that there's some sort of acid release, like a chemical reaction, and that it's like super deadly to the cows and humans if consumed. So can you explain a little bit better what that is and why that happens?
Yeah, and I'm not 100% sure on sorghum what the actual chemical is. I'll have to do a little homework on that one. But there's lots of plants that will, they go through these kind of biochemical changes due to just changes in the environment. And probably one of the classic examples for those of you that have worked with cattle or horses, the hydrocyanic acid in cherry leaves. So it's if a cherry branch falls and then it's this brief period of time where it's the acid is being converted into I guess it's starting to decompose or be released, but it's at this peak kind of a heightened I guess presence in the plant just when it's starting to dry. It's like when it's completely dry, it won't do damage. And if it's really fresh, it doesn't do damage. But kind of in between, I guess most of that is released. So unfortunately, I don't have a good specific answer for you, James, but I think in general, it's just important to note that these biochemical changes happen in response to really just any environmental cue, and it's turning different sometimes in some cases turning actual genes on the plant's genome or off that helps to regulate some of those enzymes that happen. So go ahead, Tom.
I actually was listening to something about this a week or two ago, and I just searched. In the case of sorghum, it's prussic acid, something that we know of cyanide. Because apparently the cell membranes are getting shattered, broken, and then it's releasing, and you end up with prussic acid for sorghum. And yeah, it seemed like there's another crop that I can't remember what the other one was that also did the prussic acid as well. So I can't remember what the other one was.
So yeah, the in the case of the prussic acid, I mean, so that's a different case with sorghum, actually freezing and causing the cells to burst open and then releasing that prussic acid that was once in the cells, which if you're able to keep that in there and then process it, then I guess it's not released. So does it say anything about that, Tom?
I can't remember, but I think if it frosts, you gotta you can't feed it for like a couple of weeks, and then I think the cyanide will get out of there, and then you can do it, but you just can't give it to them fast. So you can't graze if because a lot of times what they'll do is if you got a crop like sorghum, what you can do is once you've harvested or whatever, there's plants out there, you can just turn the cattle out there to graze on the leftover plants, and you just got to keep them off of there for at least 2 weeks after frosting. But
probably until the toxic aspects are leached out of it, right? And then you're left with kind of more the simple chemicals. I think that's another thing is that a lot of these chemicals are so mobile and moving inside of the plant, of course, but then also once the cells are burst open, then it can move out of the plant too. And so I guess the point I just want to drive home would just be that knowing each crop very specifically, and I mean that's why I wanted us to do these kind of specific crop projects and knowing all those little nuances of how it reacts with the different environmental cues. So I've actually been consulting with the Dharma Pharmaceuticals, the group here in Bristol that is growing medical cannabis, and they've been having issues trying to meet the Virginia Board of Pharmacy's regulations, because they basically say that it has to be at this particular temperature and humidity, so that you don't get an influx of THC is the big thing, because they do allow there to be some THC in it, but they want it to be balanced with the CBD. And that it's just all based on, the plant's response to these environmental cues. And I think the Board of Pharmacy has kind of just taken other states' regulations and applied it. So I'm not sure if they really know exactly what's going on, because some of it seems a little arbitrary, to be honest with you. But everything is all these different factors of the genotype interacting with the environment to get the actual phenotype, which we think of the phenotype as being, the physical appearance of the plant, but it's also the biochemistry of the plant itself. So yeah, and also in James' example there with sorghum, how these different things interact with each other too. So I'm sure that there's probably some sort of reaction there with the frost that's causing some of these chemicals to combine to create a toxic constituent, but again, only for that period of time, probably, really a few days within that frost. And then once the cyanide is leached out, it's safe to use again. So James, I'm guessing that in your situation, because it's so wet, you're not able to get in there to harvest the sorghum.
Oh no, like I said, we're all on the James River, so I mean we have about a little bit over a 4,000 acre farm, and I would say close to like 2,000 of our acres that are on high ground are like, I mean I have a lot of pictures of like fields the day before and then like the day after that rain where like I mean it got so bad that the bridge we go across it's lower than most bridges. They had to shut it because the James overtook it. I mean, the James jumped his bank ridiculously and just kept rising and rising. So most of our fields are underwater. I mean, you're talking like 2 to 3 feet of water. So we have, and then even when it does recede, the amount of time it's going to take now to even dry out enough to get a tractor in there or a combine or anything. It's just so the state's probably about to lose a decent amount of money, and we're probably going to have to get some of the other farms to help out with feed and stuff to try to keep up.
Yeah, that's I think one of the big issues with agriculture and how it can be a gamble, and we all kind of need to be, meteorologists in the sense that you have to know how the weather works for you, but also how it works against you, and in timing things. And with this hurricane, it was somewhat unexpected. It came so quickly, so it's hard to shift your kind of production model to get out there and do what you have to before the resulting weather comes, which in your case, how can you shift your day-to-day model to go ahead and harvest however many acres that was of sorghum that you had out there. It's all about kind of, I guess, trying to balance everything and all these different factors and variables in this equation. And it is kind of like gambling in some ways, but yeah, I'm sorry about that, James. That's one of the downfalls of river bottom land. It's like you really have good soil there usually, and you have the nutrient inputs of that flood water bringing good stuff in. But when the water's high, there's not much you can do with it. And I mean, you're always kind of gambling because you have the potential to be subject to flooding. Well, I think that actually is a pretty good intro, even though today we're talking about something slightly different here in just the cultivated plants world, really naming and classifying plants. But I think it drives home again the important point that just knowing the plant, every aspect of it, of the crop or set of crops that you're working with in each operation. So let's go ahead and get to this. I'm going to try to get through this chapter 10, naming, classifying these plants, all today, ideally. So let's go ahead and get started. In the book, they talk about there being over 500,000 different kinds of plants. And I'm not exactly sure where they got that number. That's why I highlighted it in red. Because really, there's a lot of different numbers out there when we're talking about how many kinds of plants. And I guess that word too, kind of plant, is pretty general. They believe that there are about, botanists are they in this case, they believe that there are about 400,000 species of plants on planet Earth. And I'm wondering if the book is looking at the ones that are actually named. They say about 200,000 species, 220,000 species that we actually, know. And probably amongst those, there are different cultivated varieties. So I'm wondering if that's where they got this number. Either way, though, they're saying about 400,000 species of plants on planet Earth. And I put up a link for y'all to check out. It's this organization called the Plant List, and they've kind of changed it a little bit, kind of defunct, but there's still a lot of great information on that website. It's theplantlist.org. And they basically say that there's over 1 million scientific plant names of the species rank. But that's because a lot of those names are either synonyms or used differently, maybe different spellings, or attributed to a different person who actually discovered the plant. So in terms of species, though, they say about 220,000 species. All right, so when we talk about naming plants, we often come up with some sort of simple name of the plant referring to its use or how it grows, some sort of attribute. However, it becomes confusing because a lot of those names are only used locally. So we try to create a system of classifying plants based on, a kind of a unifying factor. One of the issues that we have is that we classify plants depending on how we're going to use them. So there's all kinds of different ways to classify plants. And anybody that's growing plants commercially, we need to be able to identify and name that, crop, so that we can really, narrow down, and ideally to this species level, all of those attributes, all of these different variables that go along with it, and be able to kind of recognize that internationally. So we look in our system in the US at one way as classifying plants just by the climate. So we look at the hardiness zones and just a plant's ability to grow in the different zones. And we might look at whether it's a winter annual or a summer annual, or whether it is a warm season crop or a cool season crop. And so we're classifying these based on when they grow best. And that's an important level of classification, but it's not really looking at the actual, botany of the plant. It's just looking at when does it grow. I think it's important to know that, though, because that's one way that we're narrowing it down. And I think in terms of identifying plants and knowing, how and when to use them, that is a huge factor, is when are they able to grow. So we look at kind of these different levels, and we want to narrow them down from this, 400,000 species of possible plants on the planet down to the 220,000 named species of plants, and just kind of move it down different levels. How do we use a classification level to more narrow that down to the identity of the plant in a way that makes sense for its classification. So we classify vegetables by their edible parts, and we look at ornamentals based on their aesthetic use. Houseplants, which come from all over the world, often either in tropical areas, places like the rainforest, or in the case of like succulent plants coming from desert areas. But anywhere in the world, because we're growing them in a controlled environment, it's a different level. It's hard to classify those plants, and we could really look at anything. Whereas if we're looking at plants outside the home or in the field, we're looking at kind of a more narrow set of parameters. We also look at how different occupations and different users of the plants classify them. So foresters, for example, if you're going to use the plant for its wood, you're going to classify it based on the kind of, I guess, the durability, the strength of the wood itself. So we look at hardwoods and softwoods, and all the hardwoods, as you might guess, are hard, strong woods. And most of these are kind of the deciduous broadleaf trees. The softwoods, which I should note aren't always necessarily just soft wood, but generally they're easier to really cut and remove. So things like pines, of course, but I mean cedars, it's actually a pretty dense, it's a hard wood for being a softwood. Same with redwood, a very good preserved wood. Both cedar and redwood are very rot resistant. But in terms of actually, cutting down the trees, hardwoods, a little bit more difficult to cut down. Softwoods are a little easier. Usually hardwoods, we're thinking of the broadleaf and deciduous types, and softwoods as the narrowleaf conifer types. So that's how foresters look at wood and how we use them as well. But they're also going to classify them based on their hardiness and where they can actually grow. So, and some of these are actually very big, right? So like the softwoods here, like this Jeffrey pine on the left in California, and the redwoods, of course. They're softwoods. They do grow very tall, and they're kind of dense woods as well that are very useful in many different ways. So I don't know. I guess I'm saying that softwood and hardwood is a classification that is used, even though it doesn't necessarily make a whole lot of sense in terms of the use of those words. Most of the plants, though, we look and use their common name. And the common name is, easy to remember and pronounce and easy to use. And it's often looked at as, kind of this group of the plant characteristics that are most recognizable. But it's really only going to have value in a conversation about plants if the people that are discussing the plant know exactly what plant is being discussed. And the problem with common names is that there's so much confusion around them, because often there's so many of them, even for one plant. So take the plant jasmine, the common name jasmine. There are many different plants that are called jasmine, and they probably look similar in respect to some characteristics, but they're not necessarily closely related botanically. So here on the right, these are all different types of jasmine, and in parentheses we have the scientific name. So almost all of them have a different genus and species. This jasminum here is the, what we think of as the true jasmine. We'll see in these kind of species names here, sometimes we actually have jasmine in the name of the species. So we think that of the genus, the first word, as kind of a general grouping of plants, and then the species, the second word, as this specific epithet, which describes it in more detail. It's this member of this genus. So like with that star jasmine, Tricholospermum jasminoides, it's saying that this particular species of Tricholospermum looks more like jasmine. So anyway, some plants can have a lot of different common names as well. So it can be very confusing to use common names, especially on an international level. So we most often use the scientific name in the botanical world, because there are just so many different common names out there and they can be confusing. So the person that we most attribute to it, Theophrastus was the first person that really began classifying plants, but much later in the 1700s, Carl von Linné, also known as Linnaeus, he's the person that is really most responsible for devising the system of categorizing not just plants, but really all living organisms that has led to our modern taxonomy and naming conventions of plants. So in his system, we break everything down into taxa, and it is basically just a general word for a system of classification. So we break these taxa down into the different levels. And first thing that we might look at is the prokaryotes versus the eukaryotes. And really we're looking at single cell versus multiple celled organisms. And then we look amongst the eukaryotes as divided into the kingdoms. So the fungi kingdom, the protist kingdom, the plant kingdom, the animal kingdom. And I think some biologists have contention on this based on, what kingdoms we actually use. But for us, we're talking about the plant kingdom. And then we further divide the plant kingdom down into the next level. And there's a mnemonic device out there that we use. King Philip came over from German soil. It's the one that I was taught. There's probably a bunch of different ones out there, but it starts with each taxon, each level of classification. So King Philip is for kingdom, and then Philip for phylum, which the plural of the word phylum is phyla. So looking at the different phyla of plants, we look at first the most simple plants, those that were growing by spores and not seeds. So the mosses, for instance, excuse me, the Bryophyta, that's a phylum of plant, or the Pterophyta are spore-bearing ferns. And then we get into the seeded phyla, which is first the cycads, and the ginkgos, the coniferophyta, which is of course our conifers, also called gymnosperms, and then the anthophyta or magnoliophyta, which are called the angiosperms, the flowering plants. And of course, most of the plants that we look at are in this phylum, most of what we use as crops. Beyond phylum, we have class, order, family, genus, and species. So King Philip came over from German soil. Came is class, order is over, family for from, genus, German, species, soil. So that's one way to remember that. Come up with your own mnemonic device, whatever works for you, but just to know those different levels of classification and how we break them down. Class is mostly we're looking at whether it's a monocot or a dicot. That's the big difference between the classes of angiosperms. We don't use order very much in classifying plants. At least just for our purposes in the growing of crops. What we do mostly look at is starting at the family. when we're trying to identify plants and really study them for their uses. We started at family level because most plants are kind of visibly grouped together in the family level based on the reproductive characteristics of the plants. And back in the days of Linnaeus, kind of mid 1700s, when he started to put this system together, we were looking at these families as grouping them together on how their flowers and seeds look. And if it was, they usually divided it up into like the number of flower parts it has or the shape of the seeds. So they grouped plants into families based on that. Today, of course, we don't use just the visible characteristics. We actually use the DNA to better understand and group plants together. And in doing so, we actually proved that Linnaeus was right in many of the cases. In that time of Linnaeus, they used Latin to write most of the words. That was just kind of how they wrote it. They used some Greek too, but to this day, we use Latin for the scientific names of plants because it's a dead language and the names aren't likely to change. If we look at the common names, especially if you're thinking about like the continent of Europe, for instance, where there are so many different countries in a relatively small area and so many different languages, there's so many different common names for a plant that might have a wide range, like the white water lily, for instance, which is found both in North America and in Europe. Huge range. It's native to both of these regions, and it has all of these different languages and thus over 200 different common names. But it only has one scientific name, and it's written in Latin. So we use some of that Latin terminology to describe the plants. So knowing some Latin can be helpful, I think. So if we look at names that are referring to leaves, we might see things like folius or phyllon or phylla. These are suffixes that are accompanied often by a prefix such as macro or micro, meaning big or little. So macrophylla is a large leaf. A microphylla is a small leaf. We also might use like the genus name. So Ilicifolius it looks like a holly leaf, where Salicifolius looks like a willow leaf. So these are just some things that we add together to actually use that Latin, that scientific name to somewhat describe the plant as well. So often we look at the shapes as well. And these are just some of the different Latin words that look at those shapes, such as like compactus, meaning dense, or arboreus, meaning tree-like, with the form of it. So nanus or pumilus being dwarf, repens or reptans being creeping. We also look at the color of often the reproductive parts, like the flowers or seeds, or even leaves. So albus is white, aureus is gold, rubra is red, flavus or luteus is yellow. So again, knowing some of the Latin can be helpful, but if you start to learn a lot of the scientific names of the plants, then it'll kind of click. You'll start to see where those kind of come into play. So we try to name the species based on kind of the most identifying characteristic, how you narrow it down the most. And sometimes that can be based on the plant's place of origin. So here are just some examples of where some of these plants come from. So Australis is southern, not from Australia. Borealis is northern, not like the northern or southern lights, Australis and Aurora Australis and Aurora Borealis. Same deal. So again, just more names, kind of where they come from. We see Virginica a lot. It's meaning either it comes from Virginia or it's coming from the Virgin Country, the New World. When we get down into the scientific name itself, we refer to it as a binomial name because there are two words for that name. And they are most often in Latin. And these are all actually covered and I guess governed by this international code. And there's like a body of botanists basically that name plants based on this code. Here are some of the basic rules that we use for the actual naming of those plants. So the genus or generic name is always going to begin with a capital letter. And for both of the words, both the binomial, we use the genus and the species, they're both going to be either underlined if it's handwritten, or if it's in print on the computer, we usually italicize them. So genus is capitalized, the species is a lowercase letter. Just ignore that second sentence there, may be capitalized if it's a person's name. We actually don't do that. So to complete the binomial name, they also will include a letter at the end, which gives the person who first described it. And while that's used a lot, and if you're like writing a scientific paper, it's probably good to do that. But in practice, we really don't, use that letter. So it's just the genus and the species. Uppercase for the genus, lowercase for the species. Both words are italicized or underlined to be properly written in the binomial nomenclature. And that kind of sets it apart in type as well. So there are a couple of other things that we might use if we don't actually know the identity, or some modifiers in the genus and species in that binomial name. So if there's one single unknown species, then we just put SP period. If there are a few in a population and they look different, then we put SPP. There could be multiple species in there. So we'd still put the genus, but then we'd put SP or SPP, and we don't underline or italicize the modifiers in the scientific names. So then we also look at the different varieties, and there are natural varieties, or there are also what we create, the cultivated varieties or cultivars. So the plant groups that are different in the wild from the general species that we usually find, that is what we would consider as a natural variety. And for that, we just put this VAR period in there. So in this case, Buxus microphylla of the variety japonica, that would be a small-leafed boxwood that is only found in Japan. So this VAR we put in there for the natural varieties, but not for the cultivated varieties. Usually these are unique to a geographic area. And then it's often due to a genetic mutation. One example I think of is with the honey locust, which there was, it's naturally a very thorny plant, heavily armed, but there was an example of it being found in a particular area that had a mutation that made it thornless. So they would put that in there, var inermis. So Gleditsia tricanthos var inermis is this thornless variety that was found in nature, but then they actually cultivated it, which often you add some sort of C word onto it to get the cultivar or cultivated variety. The cultivars, what we most often use for naming varieties in the crop world, in agriculture and horticulture, we use single quotes most often. Sometimes they will also put in or instead of the single quotes, put CV to stand for cultivar, but most often the case is that they just use single quotes. And every word in that, it's not underlined or italicized, but it is all capitalized if it's multiple words. So thinking about that honey locust, there are all kinds of different varieties, cultivated varieties out there. So the original was var inermis, but then the cultivated variety would have single quotes and then whatever fancy name it is. If we're thinking about like tomatoes, for instance, variety like Cherokee purple, you'd have the scientific name of the plant, Solanum lycopersicon, and then in single quotes, you would have Cherokee purple or big boy or better boy or whatever. All right, so going back to families, we break down the families based on similarities, mostly in just the structure of the plant and the flower structure being the basis. They often have similar, chemical characteristics as well, but we're mostly looking first at the physical characteristics. So here, looking at the Solanaceae, which is the nightshade family or the tomato or potato family. And so here are some of the genera with the species. And I think botanists, sometimes they change this up so much, probably because they need job security. So Solanum here for potato. Eggplant is also in that genus, and now tomato is too. So at the time of this printing, they had a tomato in a different genus. They're constantly reclassifying these things out there. All the families' names end with this AC, ACE, ending attached, often to kind of like the namesake genus of the plant. And in these cases here, what they're putting on here, they've changed some of the new names to have a different ending. So they often actually still use both. So you can kind of ignore that, really. You can use either one, but Asteraceae is also the Compositae. Whatever, it's just botanists. They usually recognize both, so you can use either one that you want to. We're trying to identify plants. One of the things that we might use to help us is a dichotomous key. And for, in any kind of organism can be classified using this. I think of it kind of like a choose your own adventure for organisms, where we're looking at looking at one characteristic and how it can either be on or off, right? Correct or not. It's like a yes or no to each of these prompts. And we break that down into the characteristics from first, going from the most basic, most general category, and then getting more specific as we go along. So first we might look at the phylum level. So in the case of the seed-bearing plants, it has seeds. So we're already going to kind of jump past the phylum of plants that do not naturally have seeds. So we'll jump beyond, say like the cone-bearing plants, for instance. So anyway, a dichotomous key kind of looks something like this, where we have a series of choices. And for each number here, you can see that it's got choices narrowing it down below it. So for this one, ovules and seeds born naked on scales in the cones without typical flowers, and often evergreen. That's the gymnosperms. Or plants with seeds born in an ovary with typical flowers. Those are the angiosperms. So that's one way to break it down. And then below that, more specific choices, narrowing it down. But it's always an either or, only two choices, even though sometimes there's going to be multiple characteristics listed in that choice. That's a dichotomous key, and very helpful for identifying plants down to the species level. They actually just published a lot of those for the Southeast. I guess, using the new kind of DNA form of botany. Some plants are difficult to classify because they might have characteristics that kind of would put them in one phylum or order or a different one. So cycads, for instance, can be difficult because they have palm-like leaves, but botanically they're not closely related to the palms at all. Or, and on the right here, we've got the genus Taxus, which is the yews. And yews are, kind of broadly or narrow leaf evergreens, but instead of having a cone, they actually do have this kind of fleshy fruit, which I kind of think of these plants sort of as an evolutionary step. So they were moving towards the angiosperms, even though technically they're still a sperm. In this case, we've got cotton, and it can be hard to classify because of really the flower shape of that plant. Doesn't necessarily look, and the way that it changes. Cotton's pretty cool. If you've watched it grow, that flower kind of goes through several different changes, and it's got a seed type, and I guess the cotton that's surrounding the seed looks different than most of the other plants in that family. So that one's a hard one to classify as well, even though they do keep it in that family. Strawberries have a totally different type of flower and seed than most of the other things that are in the rose family, so it could be hard to classify as well. They make hard choices, but today it's all supported by DNA evidence as to why they're kind of clumped together. So when we're talking about our cultivated plants, though, they're different, much different than the plants that we find in nature. And of course, we glean kind of a lot of what we know about these cultivated plants from Vavilov, that Russian plant scientist that we talked about early on, who kind of looked at the different centers of origin for the different crops that we still grow today. And of course, that's based on the domestication of those plants. So again, I think that's important because those gene pools are still there for those wild plants. And again, the plants that we have today cultivated from these gene pools sometimes look very different from those ancient ancestors. And we talked a little bit about propagation last week, and some of those have been propagated really since these, centers of domestication and origin were discovered. I mean, they've been propagated for thousands of years and are kind of still in place. And in many of those cases, it's a clone of that original plant that was first, cultivated maybe several thousand years ago. So a lot of the cultivated plants are based on some sort of mutation, like with the grains, we talked about that shattering where they hold on to the seeds instead of naturally just dropping them. As we plant crops and save the seed from them, we're actually playing a part in their evolution. And we're continually cultivating them and changing them, selecting for stronger and more vigorous plants, just based on how we plant them and kind of prepping them for this kind of artificial system in many ways. Some of them have been changed so much that the plant really couldn't exist without human help. So for like corn, the scientific name being Zea mays, also known as maize, right? Where they get that from the species. But because it is in this kind of tight cob, all the seeds are in that, very rarely could it grow from the cob. It has to be shucked and the seeds, each individual kernel removed from that cob and replanted for it to regrow. Otherwise, they'd just be kind of crowded together. We put them in the spacing that they need. We look at wheat of the Triticum genus, which is the most widely cultivated plant in the world today, as you might expect, because it's, important in making bread. We developed it based on that shattering gene initially, but then they started to breed it to have larger seeds, or seeds that don't have as much chaff. So there are two major species of wheat today, Triticum estivum, which is used for flour, and then Turgetum, which is usually used more for making things like pasta. So we have some of these scientific names that we look at as partially being related to these changes of the plant, but also how we've kind of domesticated them for a particular use. So there are particular species that we develop and cultivate because they had a certain level of starch, for instance. So, and today, we actually have to continually develop new varieties, especially things like wheat, because we're kind of competing with the evolution of a pest organism, in this case, like stem rust disease, which is devastating to wheat crops. We have to develop new varieties that are resistant to that disease, so that we can kind of keep up, continue to develop the crop. All right, so on that note, we're about out of time, so I think we'll end off here on wheat. Does anybody have any questions or comments, concerns? All right, well, we'll talk more about plant names on Wednesday, and hopefully get into the next section talking about photosynthesis. Y'all have a great Monday.
Okay. Bye, everybody. See some of y'all in a minute.